I was recently listening to the Lex Fridman podcast. And listen, I like Lex. I think he is a pretty good interviewer. He asks really good questions. He's thoughtful. He cares. But at times I find that he either gets too close to his subject. He's really good friends with Elon Musk, for example.
I thought you were going to finish it.
And he rarely criticizes him. Or two, he's just not equipped to ask the right questions depending on the subject matter. The latter was the case when he recently interviewed John Mearsheimer.
Well, let me just embellish your argument, okay?
Thank you. I need it.
John Mearsheimer is a University of Chicago professor and is one of the most controversial academics in the world today. His views on offensive realism have drawn intense criticism from other academics around the world and even other professors within his own department. And unfortunately, Lex Fridman failed to address much of this criticism. That's publicly out there, it's available. He even conceded to him regularly.
So let me just embellish your point.
Thank you. I need all the help I can get.
So in this video, I want to address John Mearsheimer's views head on, particularly as they relate to Russia's 2022 invasion of Ukraine. But before I do, you might think this is trivial banter, best left to ivory towers and professors wearing tweed jackets. We must remember that people take what Mearsheimer says very seriously, including Russians themselves. Many people promote and repeat what Mearsheimer says. So we must hold him and anyone who platforms him or interviews him directly accountable. Also, before diving in, we must briefly address John Mearsheimer's foreign policy ideology, offensive realism. Mearsheimer is one of the most notable proponents of great power politics in the world today. And offensive realism is a school of thought that assumes that in a self-interested attempt to preserve national security, states will preemptively act in anticipation of adversaries. It emphasizes strategic over moral interests in determining how states will act. Mearsheimer's brand of offensive realism posits that anarchy in the international system, after all, there's no world state, for example, that anarchy forces states to seek supremacy over one another. This anarchy, Mearsheimer believes, leads to fear, which leads to states directly attacking each other. According to Mearsheimer's theory of offensive realism, the ideal situation for any country in international politics is that it dominates its region in the world and prevents competing countries from doing the same. This is the only way to safeguard a country's self-interest, per Mearsheimer. While there is much to critique about offensive realism and whether it's the appropriate way to view the world, in this context, it's only necessary for you to understand where Mearsheimer is coming from as it relates to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So with that in mind, let's turn to some of Mearsheimer's arguments about why Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022. Argument number one. There's no evidence that Putin was interested in conquering all of Ukraine.
My view is there is no evidence, let me emphasize, zero evidence to support that argument.
Which part that the imperialist part, the sense that he sought to conquer all of Ukraine and move on and conquer?
There's no evidence he was interested in conquering all of Ukraine. There's no evidence beforehand that he was interested in conquering any of Ukraine.
Here's a perfect example of Lex Fridman, the podcast host, failing to dig deeper for deeper nuance. Because he didn't unpack this statement from Mearsheimer, exactly what he means, specifically about the word conquer, it's pretty misleading and give the impression that Putin has never sought to even control or influence Ukraine in any way. In separate interviews that Mearsheimer has given with outlets like the New Yorker, he's gone into deeper detail as to what exactly he means when he makes absolute statements like this. Putin did and continues to this day to attack Kyiv, after all. His bombs and missiles have struck Western Ukraine. Putin has targeted the entire country. Mearsheimer, however, neglected to mention any of these facts. And also the fact that Putin tried to even march on Kyiv in the early days of the war in February of 2022. It's also important to remember that Putin wrote articles leading up to the invasion, talking about the shared unity between Ukrainians and Russians, how they're one people. In a speech he made just before the invasion, he said that it's finally time to unite, that Ukrainians are just like us, how they're one people, that they're Russians with accents. More on some of Putin's writing and speeches later. But the point here is that there's actually significant evidence that Putin has sought to exercise control and influence over all of Ukraine. There's also significant evidence that Putin viewed the Zelensky government as weak, that he thought Ukraine would fall relatively easily, that the Ukrainian people needed to be liberated from neo-Nazis, that regime change wouldn't be particularly difficult. Also recall that many Western pundits, they agreed with Putin. They were giving Ukraine as a whole, the entire country, maybe a few days or weeks, months at most, to be able to stand up to the Russian forces that were invading them, that they would eventually have to surrender and capitulate to the Russian invaders. So despite Mearsheimer saying here that there's no evidence that Putin sought to conquer all of Ukraine, there's actually a plethora of evidence. He tried to march on Kyiv early in the war, remember that. But where I agree with Mearsheimer, and get ready for the nuance here, do I think Putin wanted to occupy all of Ukraine? No, I don't think there's evidence of that. But Putin doesn't need to occupy Ukraine in order to control it. Look at Belarus, for example, which is led by a first-class Putin puppet in Alexander Lukashenko. Putin likely would have tried to install a leader similar to Lukashenko in Ukraine. Someone not interested in looking toward the West, but instead focusing on Kremlin priorities, Kremlin demands. So while I fault Lex for not pressing further, Mearsheimer is also being pretty reckless in his statements here. While I agree that there's no evidence, or little evidence at least, that Putin would want to actually occupy all of Ukraine, there's significant evidence that he wants to dominate, control, and influence Ukraine as a whole. Not only through his actions, but through everything he's written and said about what he wants to achieve in Ukraine. Argument number 2, NATO expansionism was the cause of Putin's invasion of Ukraine.
That the Russians did not want NATO on their doorstep. They made that manifestly clear when the Cold War ended, and they exacted a promise from us that we would not expand NATO. And then when we started expanding NATO, they made it clear after the first tranche in 1999 that they were profoundly unhappy with that. They made it clear in 2004 after the second tranche that they were profoundly unhappy with that expansion.
Manifestly clear? The problem with this argument is that NATO expansionism has been a variable concern over the years, not a constant one. In fact, Russians have spoken indifferently and at times even favorably about NATO expansionism. And don't just take it from me. Here's some quotes. Here's a quote on whether Russia should join NATO. Quote, "Why not? Why not? I do not rule out such a possibility. Russia is a part of European culture, and I do not consider my own country in isolation from Europe. Therefore, it is with difficulty that I imagine NATO as an enemy." Do you know who said this? Vladimir Putin in 2000, after the first round of NATO expansion. Another quote on whether Ukraine should join NATO. Quote, "Ukraine will not shy away from the processes of expanding interaction with NATO and the Western allies as a whole. Ukraine has its own relations with NATO. At the end of the day, the decision is to be taken by NATO and Ukraine. It is a matter for those two partners." Do you know who said this? Vladimir Putin in 2002, after the second round of NATO expansion was announced. A third quote on Russia's views of NATO in 2010, talking about that the period of distance in our relations and claims against each other is over now. What about this one? Who said it? Dmitry Medvedev at the 2010 NATO summit in Portugal, which was importantly after the 2008 NATO Bucharest summit. All of these statements, not to mention the lack of any real concern about NATO following the 2008 Bucharest summit and before 2014 when Putin had annexed Crimea, indicate that NATO expansionism was not a manifestly clear issue. Let's also recall that after the fall of the Soviet Union, many Eastern European countries demanded to join NATO, while the NATO countries themselves, including the United States, were not particularly interested in entertaining this. Lithuania, for example, applied directly for membership. There was no evidence of coercion from Western powers, and this type of direct application was unprecedented at the time. It was a policy goal for many other Baltic states. But Mearsheimer, of course, doesn't mention any of this. Eastern expansionism of NATO was far from imposed or even pushed by the US or other members of NATO. It was strongly desired, in fact, by many Eastern Europeans. They wanted protection from Russia's influence. In fact, Eastern European countries had to take measures to pressure the West themselves into letting them even be considered as members to NATO. But this doesn't fit with Mearsheimer's theory of NATO expansionism being the primary reason for Putin invading Ukraine in 2022. So of course, he's silent on it. There are two other reasons that the NATO expansionism argument falls flat. The first being that Russia did not attack immediately following successive rounds of NATO expansion, and Ukraine has never even had a membership action plan or any serious progress towards membership. Was North Macedonia's entrance to NATO in 2020 the one that tipped the scales for Putin? There were long periods, many years in fact, where this issue has hardly even been in the background. As I mentioned previously, it's been a variable issue, not a constant one, making it less likely that it's the true reason for causing the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022. And the second point here is that Putin should have reasonably anticipated that by attacking Ukraine, he would spook other non-NATO countries, which Ukraine still is, but he would spook other similarly situated non-NATO countries, like Finland and Sweden, who as of 2022 were not NATO members. And guess what? It did. Now Finland, which like Ukraine has a large border with Russia, is a fully ratified NATO member as of April 2023, with Sweden not far behind. So if anything, NATO has become even more unified and emboldened since Putin invaded Ukraine in 2022, not less, which if NATO expansionism was truly the motivator for the invasion, as Mearsheimer would have us believe, you would think Putin would try to do everything in his power to stop it, not provoke further expansion. So I can't agree with Mearsheimer here that NATO expansionism was what really sent Putin over the edge. Argument number 3, Putin does not have imperialist goals.
Do you think there is some degree to which he still dreams of the former Soviet Union reuniting?
No.
Definitive statements like these sometimes make me wonder, is Mearsheimer on Putin's payroll?
He's made it clear that anybody with a triple-digit IQ understands that it's nuts to think about recreating the Soviet Union. He thinks it's a tragedy that the Soviet Union fell apart. But as he made clear in that essay, the July 12th, 2021 essay, and as he made clear in speeches immediately before he invaded Ukraine, he accepted the breakup of the Soviet Union, and he accepted the status quo in Europe, save for the fact he did not accept the idea that Ukraine would become part of NATO.
How does Mearsheimer reconcile that egotistical statement with some of these words from Putin himself? These specific ones from 2005. First and foremost, it is worth acknowledging that the demise of the Soviet Union was the, quote, greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the century, end quote. Putin also went on to say, as for the Russian people, it became a genuine tragedy. Tens of millions of our fellow citizens and countrymen found themselves beyond the fringes of Russian territory. It's hard for me to figure out here if Mearsheimer is trying to give Putin the benefit of the doubt or is truly blind to the mountains of evidence suggesting that he actually has imperialistic ambitions to return Russia to the great power that the Soviet Union once was. Of course, Putin doesn't want to do this in the communist way, but by exerting authoritarian nationalism of his own flavor. As he described in the 2000 speech I quoted, he's heartbroken that millions of Russians are now beyond the fringes, beyond the borders of modern-day Russia, highly suggesting that he wants to fix what he is calling a genuine tragedy. And do you know where Putin sees many ethnic Russians? Ukraine. His 2005 speech is logically and historically consistent with his speeches and writings just before the invasion in 2022. Putin has even said that Ukraine is an illegitimate country that exists on land that is historically Russian. Ukraine actually never had stable traditions of real statehood, according to Putin. And here are a few other nuggets from his speeches and essays just before the Russian invasion of Ukraine. How do any of these reconcile with Mearsheimer's view that Putin has absolutely no imperialistic goals of reconnecting the old Soviet Union? You decide. Quote, "First of all, I would like to emphasize that the wall that has emerged in recent years between Russia and Ukraine, between the parts of what is essentially the same historical and spiritual space, to my mind is our great common misfortune and tragedy." End quote. Quote number 2, quote, "I am confident that true sovereignty of Ukraine is possible only in partnership with Russia. Our spiritual, human, and civilizational ties formed for centuries and have their origins in the same sources. They have been hardened by common trials, achievements, and victories. Our kinship has been transmitted from generation to generation. It is in the hearts and memory of people living in modern Russia and Ukraine, in the blood ties that unite millions of our families. Together we have always been and will be many times stronger and more successful, for we are one people." Close quote. Quote number 3, "Ukraine is not just a neighboring country for us, it is an inalienable part of our own history, culture, and spiritual space. Since time immemorial, the people living in the southwest of what has historically been Russian land have called themselves Russians." End quote. Quote number 4, "Radicals and nationalists, including and primarily those in Ukraine, are taking credit for having gained independence. As we can see, this is absolutely wrong. This disintegration of our united country was brought about by the historic strategic mistakes on the part of Bolshevik and Soviet leaders. The collapse of the historical Russia known as the USSR is on their conscience." End quote. Quote number 5, "You want decommunization? Very well. This suits us just fine. But why stop halfway? We are ready to show what real decommunization would mean for Ukraine." End quote. Do you notice any NATO expansionism rhetoric in any of those statements? Because I don't. Or is it simply that Putin believes that Ukrainians and Russians are one people? Furthermore, in Putin's 2014 speech announcing the annexation of Crimea, he argued that it was impossible to imagine that Ukraine and Russia may split up and become two separate states. This is direct evidence of Putin's imperialistic intentions. He wants Ukraine and Russia united. Perhaps not formally, but it is very clear he wants them united in a way where he can control and influence Ukraine, just as an imperial power would a lesser power. These are clear imperialistic aims, and I'm just simply dumbfounded why Mearsheimer doesn't even acknowledge them. And they're not my own words. These are words from Putin himself, backed up by actions that he's taken in invading not only Ukraine, but Georgia, Chechnya, the list goes on. Well, that's been an intense talk so far, so pardon me, I needed to get a glass of wine. Let's address argument number 4, that Putin is most sensitive about security.
What he said, it's quite clear that he privileged security or survival. He was deeply concerned about the security of Russia.
No, Putin is specifically sensitive about democracy, which unfortunately Lex Fridman failed to address at all in the interview with John Mearsheimer. Now, when I'm saying that, I'm not discounting Putin's sensitivities to security. Given how vast Russia is, bordering China, bordering Europe, he definitely has cause for concern about Russia's security. But as the leader of what's now an autocratic nation that Putin has effectively been at the helm for over 2 decades, his most sensitive security risk is that of a burgeoning, thriving, prosperous democracy on Russia's doorstep. One where Russian citizens might turn and look to see a city on the hill that's doing well and setting an example that Russians might soon aspire to. Anything that threatens Putin's grip on power or his ability to wield unchecked power in Russia and in the region is a threat that Putin can never accept. It's existential for him.
The fact that Americans are not very good at putting themselves in the shoes of other countries. You really, if you're going to be a first-class strategist in international politics, you have to be able to do that. You have to put yourself in the shoes of the other side.
Let's put ourselves in Putin's shoes. When he sees the democratic color revolution, starting with the Rose Revolution in Georgia, the Orange Revolution in Ukraine in the early 2000s, fast forward to the Arab Spring in the 2010s, what happened to Gaddafi in Libya? Putin sees himself in Gaddafi. And after all of that happened, Putin vowed that that would never happen in Russia, which is why when he was re-elected, and I put that in quotes, in 2012, taking over from Medvedev, he was a very different Vladimir Putin. He was one that ruled more autocratically and more anti-Western, and specifically anti-democratic. He had learned the hard way that he could never let a democracy thrive either on Russia's doorstep or certainly within Russia if he wanted to maintain a tight grip on power and autocratic rule. He also had suspicions, not completely unfounded by the way, that the Americans were behind many of the democratic uprisings during that time period. Remember, this is a former KGB agent that we're talking about. He's naturally suspicious and paranoid about everything and thinks the American boogeyman is pulling the strings behind it all. Let's be honest, while there is some evidence that America is to blame for some of those democratic uprisings, people also have a capability of thinking independently. Once they get a taste and flavor for democracy and individual freedom and liberty, people tend to like that taste, which is why you saw hundreds of thousands of people protesting across Ukraine, Georgia, many of the other former Soviet republics, protesting in favor of democracy against authoritarian regimes and specifically against Putin himself. For the Ukrainians, their 2014 protests were called their Revolution of Dignity, whereas for Putin, it was a neo-Nazi coup inspired by the United States. But let's be clear here. Democratic expansionism, not NATO expansionism, is what's really driving Putin to act aggressively in Ukraine. So while Mearsheimer may be right about Putin's sensitivities towards security, he's most sensitive about democratic movements that threaten his autocratic grip on power. Argument number 5, the Americans and the British sabotaged a chance at peace in Ukraine in 2022 when Neftali Bennet, then Prime Minister of Israel, was near the finish line at brokering peace.
The two sides were negotiating in Istanbul, and they were also negotiating through Neftali Bennet. And the Bennet track and the Turkish track were operating together. I mean, they were not at cross purposes at all. What happened? Bennet tells the story very clearly that they had made significant progress in reaching an agreement. This is Zelensky on one side and Putin on the other. Bennet is talking in person to both Putin and Zelensky. And what happens to produce failure? The answer is the United States and Britain get involved and tell Zelensky to walk.
Is Mearsheimer interested in making any non-Russian talking points? Mearsheimer seems to be basing this point on commentary from Bennet that was edited in such a way to place more blame on America and Britain than was actually the case. Bennet has since walked back his statements and clarified, but Mearsheimer either hasn't heard those clarifications or doesn't really care to listen. Bennet clarified that the ultimate failure to strike a peace agreement was strong evidence of a massacre of civilians in Bucha, Ukraine, which is under investigation as an apparent war crime. This prompted Kyiv to break off talks. Remember, it's ultimately Ukraine who decides whether to agree to a peace agreement or not. America and other countries like Britain can certainly influence things, but they aren't the ultimate authority. The bottom line here is that it wasn't the United States or Western countries or NATO that ended any peace talks. Instead, it was first and foremost Russia continuing to escalate their attacks on innocent Ukrainian civilians. That destroyed any chance of peace at the time. And that's something that neither Mearsheimer nor Lex brought up throughout the course of this discussion whatsoever. Argument number 6. Russians took Minsk seriously.
I believe the Russians took the Minsk Accords seriously. I believe Putin took them very seriously. He wanted to shut down that conflict.
The Minsk agreements were an attempt to end the conflict in Ukraine that started in 2014 following Russia's annexation of Crimea. It's a reminder that this conflict, it's been ongoing since 2014. The war did not start in 2022. Contrary to what Mearsheimer would have you believe, there's actually a lot of evidence suggesting Putin operated completely in bad faith and undermined the fundamental purpose of the agreements. A comprehensive ceasefire should have entered into force at midnight on February 15th, 2015, but heavy fighting by Russian separatists continued and persisted throughout parts of the year. Angela Merkel representing Germany and Francois Hollande representing France both acknowledged that peace was unlikely from the Minsk agreements because Putin did not even appear to be trying to stop the fighting. Putin made it simply impossible for diplomacy to succeed. And he's continued this course of action with further illegal land grabs in Ukraine. Argument number 7. No prospect of a meaningful peace agreement. This, unfortunately, is one of the few areas where I 100% agree with Mearsheimer. At the end of last year, in 2022, I predicted that in 2023, Ukraine and Russia would reach a stalemate. All right, guys, I got 11 predictions for you. Politics, economics, technology for 2023. Let's go. Ukraine will fight Russia to a stalemate with additional Western support. The Bradley tanks from the US are just the latest sign that they plan to bleed Putin dry. Ukraine, though, is in an impossible position right now. If they broker a ceasefire, what's to say Putin doesn't act aggressively again? And what will it cost to even reach a ceasefire? Zelensky and any other democratically leaning candidate would probably have to go. As I've mentioned, I highly doubt Putin would agree to any peace treaty should it involve a Ukrainian leader being put in office that is any way Western looking. They would have to be totally subservient to Putin. The threat of a democracy on Russia's doorstep is simply too great. In conclusion, I think John Mearsheimer actually operates in good faith. I don't think he's a Russian asset, despite many of his very pro-Kremlin talking points, and the fact that Kremlin and Putin seem to love him. I do think he's honest about his analyses and opinions and his worldview as an offensive realist. But when it comes to Ukraine and its invasion by Russia since 2014, John Mearsheimer could not be more mistaken. When in fact his book from decades ago, Tragedy of Great Power Politics, provides the best offensive realism reason to explain Russia's behavior over the past century, including today, that like all great powers, it seeks to dominate its region. That is ultimately the cause of the current war, why it invaded Ukraine, and why it will never be content so long as Putin or similar leaders rule to allow a Western-looking and aspiring democracy to thrive on its borders. Thank you for watching and listening. Please be sure to subscribe. We're aiming to publish a new video and podcast weekly. Also be sure to subscribe to the weekly newsletter. It goes out every Monday. You can find a link to that in the episode description. There are also a number of other related articles for further reading, should you be interested. And finally, I'll leave you with this. Regardless of what your ultimate opinion is on what caused Russia to invade Ukraine, what I really hope that you take away from this, it's that nuanced, thoughtful thinking is required in these types of situations. We can't just go off of whatever the most popular soundbite is that's being sent around the internet. We need to really step back, consider the history of the situation, consider the powers at play, what their prejudices are, what their biases are, and what their ultimate motivations are. We can all play a role in promoting critical thinking and nuanced thought. The world needs more of that than ever today, and I hope you'll join me in trying to make that happen.